In the spring of 2017, a state prosecutor in Nashua, New Hampshire, named Allison Quinones-Webb walked into a courtroom carrying no fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitness, no confession, no weapon, no clear surveillance footage, and no recovered crime scene. She walked into that courtroom representing the state of New Hampshire in the first-degree murder trial of a 47-year-old woman named Madeleine Dorian, who was accused of poisoning her husband, Richard Dorian, to death over a period of approximately 14 months between 2014 and 2015. Madeleine Dorian, on the day the trial began, had been free for 2 years while the case had been built around her. There was no piece of physical evidence in the case that by itself proved she had killed anyone. There was no piece of testimony that anyone had seen her do anything. By every traditional measure of homicide prosecution, the case should not have been winnable. Allison Quinones-Webb won it anyway. Madeleine Dorian was convicted on a vote of 12-0 of first-degree murder by poisoning and was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. This is the story of how a prosecutor wins a murder case in which no physical evidence directly proves murder. It is also the story of how that prosecution strategy, increasingly common in the post-2015 era of forensic skepticism, has changed the way the American justice system thinks about what it means to prove guilt. Let me give you some context before we enter the Dorian case. Because what Allison Quinones-Webb did in the Nashua courtroom is part of a pattern that has become more prevalent over the past decade. Between 2015 and 2024, the rate of first-degree murder convictions in cases involving zero direct physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no weapon, no eyewitness, increased in U.S. state courts by approximately 31%. The increase has not been uniform across jurisdictions. It has concentrated in the courts of the Northeast and a band of Midwestern states, where prosecutors have developed and refined a specific strategy that legal scholars have begun to call pattern-of-life prosecution. Pattern-of-life prosecution works as follows. Rather than building a case around a single piece of physical evidence, the way most murder prosecutions have historically been structured, the prosecution constructs a case around the cumulative pattern of the defendant's behavior in the months and years surrounding the death. The defendant's financial transactions are mapped. The defendant's communications are subpoenaed and analyzed. The defendant's relationships are interviewed and characterized. The defendant's medical and pharmacy records are reviewed. The defendant's online searches are recovered and contextualized. From each of these data streams, the prosecution extracts incidents that individually are explicable in innocent terms, but that collectively form a behavioral pattern that the prosecution argues only makes sense if the defendant was planning, executing, and covering up a murder. The first prominent successful application of this strategy in the United States was the 2014 conviction of a woman named Mona Devereaux in Connecticut, who was convicted of murdering her brother-in-law for life insurance proceeds, despite the absence of any direct physical evidence connecting her to his death. The Devereaux case became, in prosecutorial circles, a kind of teaching document. Its trial transcripts were studied in continuing legal education sessions, its strategies broken down in legal journals, its specific evidentiary moves replicated in subsequent cases. By the time Allison Quinones-Webb took the Madeleine Dorian case to trial in 2017, the pattern-of-life model had been used successfully in approximately 23 cases nationally. It had also been used unsuccessfully, meaning ended in acquittal, in approximately 14. The strategy was, by 2017, demonstrably winnable but not reliably so. What made the Dorian case important within this body of prosecution work is that it became, by the end of the trial, one of the cleanest examples of the strategy's full execution. It was used after as a teaching case for prosecutors learning the method. Madeleine Dorian was a 45-year-old administrative manager at a regional accounting firm at the time her husband died. She had been married to Richard Dorian, a 51-year-old commercial real estate broker, for 21 years. They had 2 children, a daughter, 20, who was a student at the University of Vermont, and a son, 17, who was a junior at the local high school in Nashua. The Dorians lived in a 4-bedroom colonial-style house on Larkspur Lane in a residential neighborhood that the local real estate listings described as established and family-oriented. Their household income was approximately $190,000 per year, split roughly evenly between Madeleine's and Richard's salaries. Richard Dorian died on May 11, 2015, at the age of 51. The cause of death, as recorded by the medical examiner, was cardiac arrest secondary to congestive heart failure. He had been diagnosed with a worsening cardiac condition over the preceding 18 months. His cardiologist, who had managed his care, had been adjusting his medications quarterly in response to a deterioration that, by the cardiologist's later testimony, had been faster and more refractory to treatment than I would have predicted, given his initial presentation. Richard had also experienced, during the same 18 months, what his primary care physician characterized as a constellation of secondary symptoms: recurrent gastrointestinal distress, intermittent neurological symptoms, including tingling in his extremities and brief episodes of confusion, and a slow decline in his white blood cell count. These symptoms were attributed contemporaneously to a combination of his cardiac medications, his progressing heart condition, and the stress of his work. The medical record does not contain any indication, prior to Richard Dorian's death, that any of the physicians treating him suspected poisoning. Approximately 3 weeks after Richard's death, a routine post-mortem toxicology screen ordered as part of the death certification process produced an anomalous result. The screen, which had been ordered primarily for legal documentation purposes, as Richard Dorian had a substantial life insurance policy that required a clean tox screen for full payout, detected trace concentrations of a heavy metal compound in his tissues that was not consistent with any of his prescribed medications, any commonly encountered environmental contamination, or any natural physiological process. The medical examiner referred the finding to the local police department. The local police department referred the case to the State Attorney General's office. The State Attorney General's office assigned an investigator who, over the next 4 months, expanded the toxicology testing, exhumed Richard Dorian's body for a more detailed forensic examination, and reviewed the medical history of his last 2 years of life. By December 2015, the state had concluded that Richard Dorian had been poisoned over an extended period using a heavy metal compound consistent with thallium, administered in small doses, sufficient to cause chronic toxicity, but not large enough to produce the abrupt symptoms that would have triggered an emergency room investigation. The total cumulative dose, distributed over 14 months, had been sufficient to fatally compromise his already deteriorating cardiac system. Madeleine Dorian was named a person of interest in January 2016. She was not arrested. She continued to live in the family home with her son. She continued to work at the accounting firm. She continued to receive her husband's life insurance payout, a payout of approximately $1.1 million, which had cleared the post-mortem investigation in late 2015 because the toxicology finding had not yet been incorporated into the death classification at the time the insurance company processed the claim. The state spent 14 months building its case before charging her. The arrest came in March 2017. The trial began 2 months later. I want to walk through the case Allison Quinones-Webb built, because the structure is the part that matters. Each piece of the prosecution, taken alone, would have been insufficient. The case worked because of how the pieces fit together. The first piece was the financial record. The state's forensic accountants mapped every transaction in the Dorian family's financial life for the 4 years preceding Richard's death. They identified a pattern. Beginning approximately 2 years before Richard's death, Madeleine had been making small but systematic financial preparations consistent with planning for life as a widow. She had opened, in her own name only, a brokerage account into which she deposited approximately $43,000 over 18 months. Funds drawn from the household's joint account in installments that were each individually too small to flag automated review. She had purchased, through her employer's group plan, an individual life insurance policy on herself that increased her financial stability for her children in the event of her own death. A kind of backdoor estate planning that was not in itself suspicious, but that the prosecution argued was inconsistent with the contemporaneous representations she was making to her husband about household finances. The second piece was the medical record. The prosecution did not allege that Madeleine had administered a single fatal dose. They alleged that she had administered small doses over 14 months. each one calibrated to be small enough to escape clinical notice. They presented expert testimony establishing that the symptoms Richard had experienced, the gastrointestinal distress, the neurological symptoms, the blood count changes, were each clinically consistent with chronic heavy metal toxicity at subacute doses. The expert witnesses noted, importantly, that these symptoms were also consistent with the explanations Richard's doctors had attributed them to: medications, side effects, progressing cardiac disease, stress. The expert testimony was not that the medical record proved poisoning. The expert testimony was that the medical record was equally consistent with chronic poisoning, and that the absence of any other plausible explanation for the heavy metal in Richard's tissues required the medical record to be reread through that lens. The third piece was the online activity record. The state had obtained, through forensic recovery of Madeleine's personal laptop, fragments of browser activity that had been deleted but not fully wiped. The fragments included searches conducted between October 2013 and March 2014, the months immediately preceding Richard's first symptoms, that included queries on the metabolism of various heavy metals in the human body, queries on chronic versus acute poisoning timelines, and queries on the detectability of heavy metals in standard toxicology screens. The fragments did not include any explicit references to poisoning a specific person. They were research-oriented. They were also, the prosecution argued, exactly what someone planning to poison their spouse would research. The fourth piece was the communications record. The state subpoenaed Madeleine's phone, email, and text message records for the relevant period. They identified a pattern in her communications with her sister, who lived in Florida, in which Madeleine had, on 6 separate occasions across the 18 months before Richard's death, made statements that the prosecution characterized as predicting a future without Richard. Statements like, "I have been thinking about what life might look like if Richard's health doesn't improve, and I have been making plans for after." The communications were not confessions. They were not statements of intent. They were, the prosecution argued, the kind of communications that would naturally occur in someone who knew what was coming. The fifth piece was the relationship record. The prosecution called 4 witnesses: 2 former co-workers of Madeleine's, 1 neighbor, and 1 of Madeleine's adult cousins, each of whom had had conversations with Madeleine in the relevant period in which she had expressed dissatisfaction with her marriage. The conversations were not, in any individual case, dramatic. They were not exchanges in which Madeleine had said she wished her husband would die. They were ordinary conversations in which Madeleine had said her marriage was not what it used to be, that Richard had become a person I no longer recognize, that she had thought about leaving but did not believe she could afford to. The witnesses were not painting a picture of a woman who was planning a murder. They were, the prosecution argued, painting a picture of a woman who had reasons to want her husband gone, and who, when those reasons converged with the practical means and the time and opportunity available, had acted. The sixth piece was the timeline. The prosecution constructed a chronological narrative in which each piece of evidence, financial, medical, online communications relationship, was placed on a single timeline running from January 2013 through May 2015. The timeline was the prosecution's most powerful presentational tool. Individually, the evidence was diffuse. On the timeline, the evidence formed a sequence: research, then financial preparation, then medical onset, then financial completion, then death. The defense did not have a counter timeline. The defense argued instead that the prosecution's timeline was a story imposed on a set of facts that had other explanations. The defense argued that the financial preparations were consistent with a midlife couple planning for retirement and contingencies. The defense argued that the online searches were within the range of normal curiosity for an educated adult. The defense argued that the communications with the sister and the conversations with the co-workers and neighbor were typical of a woman in a long-running marriage that had passed its romantic peak. The defense argued that Richard Dorian had died of a heart condition his cardiologist had been monitoring for years, and that the heavy metal in his tissues had an as-yet unidentified environmental source. Perhaps related to a particular brand of supplements he had taken, perhaps related to plumbing in their home. The defense did not, in the formal sense, fail. Madeleine Dorian was represented by a competent and well-resourced attorney. and the defense made every argument it could reasonably have made. What the defense could not do, structurally, was construct an alternative narrative that explained all of the evidence. The defense could explain individual pieces. It could not explain the convergence. This is the structural advantage that pattern of life prosecution holds over circumstantial defense. The prosecution does not have to prove any single piece of evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution has to assemble a quantity of pieces such that the only narrative that explains all of them is the prosecution's narrative. The defense, to win, would need to construct an alternative narrative that explains all of them with equal coherence. In a case with 5 or 6 pieces, this is often possible. In a case with 12 or 15 pieces, all assembled on a coherent timeline, it becomes very difficult. The Dorian defense was forced into the position of arguing that each piece of evidence had a benign explanation. That is a legitimate defense. It is also, when the jury is looking at a coherent prosecution narrative, an unconvincing one. Jurors interviewed after the trial described their reasoning in remarkably consistent terms. One juror said, in an interview with a legal journalist, "We didn't believe the defense was lying. We just thought the prosecution's story was the only story that explained everything we'd been shown." That sentence is the entire engine of pattern of life prosecution. Madeleine Dorian was convicted on July 14, 2017. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict was unanimous. She was sentenced 3 weeks later to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her 2 children, by the time of the verdict, had taken opposite positions. Her daughter, who had been 20 at the time of her father's death, had over the course of the investigation come to believe that her mother had killed her father. She did not attend the verdict. She has not visited her mother in prison. She has, in the years since, given one public interview in which she described the experience of accepting that her mother had murdered her father as the slowest grief I have ever felt, because there was no specific day on which it became real. Her son, who had been 17 at the time of his father's death, has taken the opposite position. He believes his mother is innocent. He has visited her in prison regularly. He has been involved in efforts to support an appeal of her conviction. The appeal was filed in 2019 and was denied in 2020 on the grounds that the original trial had not contained any procedural errors and that the evidence, while circumstantial, had been sufficient as a matter of law to support the verdict. Madeleine Dorian, in the prison interviews she has given since her conviction, has maintained that she did not kill her husband. She has acknowledged that her marriage had been difficult. She has acknowledged that she had been thinking about leaving. She has acknowledged that the heavy metal in Richard's tissues was inexplicable to her. She has, however, denied administering anything to him. She has been unable to provide an alternative explanation for the heavy metal that has satisfied any of the appellate reviewers of her case. The pattern of life prosecution strategy has continued to expand in Yorkshire in the years since the Dorian conviction. Approximately 40 additional cases have used the model since 2017. The conviction rate across those 40 cases has been approximately 68%. Higher than the conviction rate for direct evidence murder cases of similar profile, which is closer to 73%, but significant for a strategy operating without direct evidence. What this means for the American justice system is contested terrain. Defense attorneys and civil liberties organizations have raised concerns that pattern of life prosecution lowers, in practice, the burden of proof for first-degree murder. They argue that a jury that votes to convict on the basis of a coherent narrative built from circumstantial evidence has effectively replaced the constitutional, beyond a reasonable doubt standard with a best available explanation standard. The two are not legally the same. The first is supposed to require that no reasonable alternative explanation exists. The second only requires that the prosecution's explanation is more compelling than the defense's. Prosecutors and their allies argue by contrast that pattern of life prosecution is exactly what the system needs in an era when smart criminals know how to leave no physical evidence. They argue that requiring direct evidence in an era of widespread forensic awareness would allow sophisticated killers to operate with impunity. They argue that the cumulative weight of indirect evidence can be probative beyond reasonable doubt, and that juries are capable of distinguishing between weak circumstantial cases and strong ones. Both arguments are partially correct. The truth, as is usually the case, depends on the specific case in question. Some pattern-of-life prosecutions are strongly justified by an overwhelming weight of circumstantial evidence. Some are weakly justified by speculative connections dressed up as a coherent narrative. The system does not currently have a reliable way of distinguishing between the two at the trial level. That is a structural feature of jury-based adjudication. It is also, in cases where the prosecution's narrative is more compelling than the truth, a system that produces wrongful convictions. Whether the Dorian conviction was correct is a question I cannot answer. The evidence presented at trial was, by any fair reading, consistent with a deliberate poisoning by Madeleine Dorian. It was also, by the same reading, not exclusively consistent with that scenario. A reasonable person could disagree about whether the conviction met the constitutional standard. The jury that convicted her believed it did. The appellate courts that have reviewed it have agreed. The system has spoken. What I can say is that pattern-of-life prosecution is here to stay. It will continue to be refined and applied. The conviction rate will likely continue to be high. Some of the convictions will be unambiguously correct. Some will be more contested. The American justice system will, in this period of forensic skepticism, navigate the trade-off between false positives and false negatives in a way that will produce both kinds of error in different cases. And the people in the rooms where those decisions are made will not always know which kind of error they are producing. Madeleine Dorian's house on Larkspur Lane was sold in 2018. The new owners were a young couple with 2 small children. They renovated the kitchen the year they moved in. The renovation involved removing the original kitchen cabinetry, which had been installed when the Dorians had purchased the house in 1996. Behind one of the lower cabinets, the contractor doing the demolition found a small wooden box about the size of a paperback book that had been wedged between the cabinet frame and the wall. The contractor opened it. It was empty. The new owners did not know what it had been used for. They threw it out. The trash collection took it on a Tuesday. The truck drove it to the regional waste facility. It was incinerated at approximately 11:50 a.m. the same day. No one ever filed any report about it. No one ever knew what it was. The cabinets are pale gray now, and the children who live in the house make their breakfast there each morning before school.